The story of Moses receiving the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai directly from the hand of God is well known to every student of the Bible and also to most of the Christian world. It was at Mount Sinai that God established the nation of Israel as a God-fearing nation, a people destined to receive the promises that God made to Abraham in the Bible centuries before. However, the film I made deals not with Israel as a nation, but with the location of the traditional site of Mount Sinai. I had intended to make a film entitled Sinai, the Birth of a Nation. But after a few days of filming in the area, including a climb to the summit of the mountain and a visit to the 1,400-year-old monastery of St. Catherine, I tore up my script and started to write another one. We filmed all the traditional sites around Mount Sinai relating to the Bible, even a portion of the traditional site or route of the Exodus. As I did so, a new title came to my mind, resulting in the film you're about to see. Welcome to Mount Sinai. I am Raymond Capt, biblical archaeologist and historian. Join me for a closer look at the mountain behind me, traditionally identified as the Mountain of Moses, where he received the 10 Commandments written on stone tablets by the very finger of God. Nestling at the foot of the mountain is St. Catherine's Monastery, believed to be the oldest Christian monastery in nearly uninterrupted existence since the 5th century AD. The monastery claims to enshrine many of the most famous religious sites of the Bible, one being the burning bush in which God appeared to Moses, commanding him to lead his people out of Egypt. Is this truly the biblical Sinai? The 3 peaks of the mountain suggesting the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Most Bible scholars would answer yes. However, this acceptance is due to a lack of understanding of its geographical location and its geological character. Both its geography and its geology are in contradiction to the scriptural narrative. Furthermore, the weight of centuries of acceptance of this mountain as the biblical Sinai makes it difficult for one to even consider a different location. However, research can show that this Mount Sinai received its name Jebel Musa, or Mount of Moses, only in the 2nd century AD by Greek monks who settled around the mountain over 1,300 years after the Exodus. A spring in a nearby valley basin they claim was the Pool of Moses. They identified a nearby rock as the one Moses struck, and from which water came forth for the thirsty Israelites. In their zeal, the Hermans identified a growing bush as the burning bush of the Scriptures. But Mount Sinai was not the earliest traditional site of the Mountain of Moses, so before we examine Mount Sinai and the unique St. Catherine's Monastery, let us first visit Mount Serbal, some 30 miles north of Sinai, which was, for the first 2 centuries AD, considered to be the biblical Sinai. At the foot of Mount Serbal is the oasis of Faran, the most beautiful and fertile area of the lower Sinai Peninsula. Here there is rich foliage, shade, and moist vegetable soil, and date palms of unusual size, intermingling with tamarisk, the manna-bearing tree that supplied our ancestors with food, and the acacia, armed with its fearful spikes. The Arabs who live here still believe that Mount Serbal is the true biblical Sinai. They are very friendly toward strangers, especially the little girls who are always anxious to have their picture taken, with coins, of course. The Arab girls spend most of their time minding the goats while their brothers attend school. The Arabs who live here may be in part descended from the ancient Amalekites who once occupied the area. The ruins of a hilltop Amalekite city has been found, overlooking the oasis, giving rise to the belief that Pharaoh is a biblical Rephidim. It's only a short climb to the ruins of the ancient city, which was occupied by about 8,000 persons at any one time, a force far too small to have taken on the hundreds and thousands of Israelites passing through their area. Believing this to be the Rephidim of the Bible, the early Christian monks built many churches, even a small cathedral in the 5th century. One church rebuilt is still in use today. Although Pharaoh cannot be the Rephidim of the Exodus, the children of Israel did pass through this wadi, which is the only natural pass eastward across the Sinai Peninsula. It connects the Wadi Sheikh, a fertile valley some 80 miles long, which opens out at the upper end of the Gulf of Aqaba. The wadi contains several springs of bitter water, which fit the biblical story, and tamarisk trees like this are found over a 100-mile stretch of the route of the Exodus. Trees from which the Arabs still today gather manna, a small whitish growth which has a honey-like taste. I found that the range of peaks of Mount Serbal failed to fit the biblical descriptions of Mount Sinai. So now let us go back down south and take a closer look at the traditional Sinai. This was the subject of several paintings by David Roberts, who visited Jebel Musa in 1839. According to all legends and inscriptions, the Greek monks and hermits started settling around Jebel Musa between the 2nd and 5th centuries AD, living in small caves and rude shelters. Many of these early sites are marked by crosses and other inscriptions on nearby rocks. These early monks came to believe that the summit of Jebel Musa was the Sinai where Moses communed with God, and it was they who gave the mountain its present name, Sinai. This was over 1,500 years after the Exodus. In the 2nd century, Queen Helena, mother of Constantine the Great, heard of the burning bush and came and built a stone chapel over it. And in the 5th century, Justinian enclosed the chapel in a fortress, which was also designed to protect the monks from the Saracen tribesmen. The fortress, known today as St. Catherine's Monastery, is reached by a sandy road running up a small wadi and passing alongside the monastery gardens, which are protected by stone walls from the flash floods which sweep past the fortress every rainy season. The gardens produce vegetables, fruit, and nuts for the inhabitants of the monastery, but it was the fame of the burning bush that drew hundreds of monks and hermits to Mount Sinai. An example of the old adage about building a better mousetrap, the Sinai monks baited their trap with the burning bush, a bait which even caused many monks at Mount Serbal to relocate at Mount Sinai. St. Catherine's Monastery received its name in the 9th century when bones were found nearby and brought to the monastery. They were believed to have been the bones of St. Katrina of Alexandria, who was martyred on the wheel in the 4th century. The monastery of St. Catherine is a starkly isolated bastion about the size of a city block lying against the slope of a steep-sided wadi. There are only a few windows, and less than 100 years ago, visitors and monks alike had to enter by being hoisted up in a large basket to an opening in the upper part of the wall. The little dormer projecting from the wall held the pulley and rope, which hoisted the basket up by means of a windlass, a system used for over 1,400 years, only the rope being replaced from time to time. Little has changed in the 14 centuries during which the monastery has stood, except that a small opening was cut in the wall at ground level about 100 years ago. Visitors today enter through a small metal door, usually guarded by a monk. Visitors' hours are only from 9 a.m. to 12 noon. St. Catherine's has been likened to a miniature town with narrow paved streets, small courts, covered passages, and whitewashed buildings, all piled on top of each other. Its water supply comes from a well, said to have been the well of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, who was supposed to have lived here with his 7 daughters and household. Most of the interior buildings were built several centuries after Justinian constructed the fortress in the 5th century. The church, although started by Justinian, was finished by his successor. The buildings, erected in different ages and for different purposes, are most irregular. Some are built against the outer wall. Rough wooden galleries with little upper chambers are set high on the roofs of most of the buildings. The most recent construction is a library wing and icon gallery to hold the monastery's pricest manuscripts and paintings. Here we see the church on the right, the bell tower in the middle, and a white mosque on the left, constructed for the Muslim servants who serve the monastery. Roberts painted this picture of the monastery showing some of the monks. Only a dozen or so monks reside today in the monastery, although in times past they were often several hundred at a time, mostly from Greece or Russia. Today they come and go, not spending their entire lives here as in times past. The church is a fine example of Byzantine architecture, but its entrance is through a beautifully carved door, which is now obscured by a modern covering. The interior of the church is very ornate, with burnished chandeliers, gold and silver censers, and real ostrich eggs, at one time very valuable commodities, hanging from the ceiling. The walls are richly decorated with priceless works of art, including over 2,000 mosaics and hundreds of religious paintings. Above the central altar is the figure of Christ on the cross. It is over 1,000 years old and is considered a masterpiece of Byzantine art. On the right is the great throne for the Archbishop when he visits St. Catherine's. He resides in Cairo. David Roberts' painting of the interior of the church shows little change over the last 150 years. And he also depicted the Archbishop's throne, seen on the right of this painting. The marble floors are today covered with rugs. Little has changed in the daily life of the monks of St. Catherine as they continue the tradition of retirement from this world and preparation for the next. They dress in their ceremonial robes for worship on special holy days when devout visitors participate in ceremonial worship and processions.
Σήμερα το πρωί there is
Αναστάσεις από το τάφετος πριν και με την όνιωση και μεγαλέων.
Χριστός Ανέστη.
Among the works of art is this painting of the Virgin Mary. It is over 1,000 years old. She is holding the Christ child. It was the rising tide of Islam that isolated St. Catherine's from Constantinople, thus enabling the monastery to preserve its priceless icons and other treasures from destruction by order of the higher authorities of the Orthodox Church. The church contains many paintings of the Virgin Mary, dating from hundreds of years ago. This interesting painting depicts monks and an archbishop in white climbing a ladder to heaven while the devils catch the falling souls. A 7th century painting of Peter shows him holding the keys to heaven and a crossed staff, and is considered by some scholars to be the most beautiful icon in existence. Peter's thoughtful, penetrating expression contrasts sharply with his whirling tufts of hair on his forehead and the wavy strokes of the beard. Subtle devices used by the artist to convey Peter's restless temper. St. Catherine's Chapel of the Burning Bush is considered most sacred by Greek Orthodoxy because they believe that it covers the actual roots of the bush, which burned in the presence of Moses and was not consumed. But they do not explain its too close proximity to Jethro's well, which served Jethro's household. The central feature of the Church of St. Catherine is the magnificent mosaic depicting the transfiguration of Jesus. It arcs the wall above the altar and is the earliest and most beautiful of the Eastern Church, and has remained in its entirety for over 1,400 years to this day. Its theme is taken from Matthew chapter 17, verse 2. A close-up of the head of Christ shows the individual cubes used in the making of this mosaic. By the right of Jesus stands the prophet Elijah, while on the left of Jesus is Moses. John kneels at the right of the feet of Jesus, while James kneels at the left of the feet of his master. Under the feet of Jesus, Peter, still heavy with sleep, lies prone on the ground. And a close-up of the head of Peter shows how the artist set the cubes at slightly different angles in order to produce a diffused reflection of the head. Two scenes outside and above the figure of Christ feature Moses, and here he is seen removing his shoes before the burning bush. This is a close-up of the head of Moses. And here Moses is receiving the tablets of the law from the hand of God. In the margins circling the figure of Christ are the heads of the 12 disciples of Christ, including Andrew, seen here, a stern-looking Paul, James, the cousin of Christ, Matthew, the tax collector, also in the margins are the figures of the prophets, including Daniel, Malachi, a minor prophet, David, the son of Jesse, and a rather sad-looking Jonah. Well, he had something to be sad about. The mosaic of the Transfiguration contains two figures in medallions. One, the Virgin Mary. The other is of John the Baptist. There are two other figures. One is of Longinus, the abbot at the time of the making of the monastery. The other is of John the deacon of the same period. As the fame of St. Catherine's spread, gifts from the devout from all over the world poured into the monastery. Priceless jewelry is set with precious stones, solid gold and silver works of art, including crosses studded with pearls and other precious stones, all testifying to the wealth that flowed into the Orthodox monasteries from the Tsars of Russia, mostly after the 17th century. Royalty even donated their jewel-encrusted crowns as homage to St. Catherine. However, the greater treasure of the monastery is the ancient manuscripts found in its library. There are over 3,000 manuscripts, mostly dealing with Christian subjects, 2/3 of which were written in Greek, the rest in Arabic, Syriac, Georgian, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, and Slavonic. The most famous manuscript is the Greek Codex Sinaiticus, dating from the 5th century AD. I am holding a facsimile. The original copy is in the British Museum, taken from the monastery by the German scholar Tischendorf in 1959. The cemetery of St. Catherine's is about 100 feet square, obviously far too small for the burials for 1,400 years. So each new burial required the oldest burial to be excavated and the bones placed in the charnel house, skulls going in one room and the leg bones in another, and so on. Now let us take a closer look at Mount Sinai itself. Today there are two ways of getting to the summit. The first, which was the only way for over 1,000 years, was to climb some 7,800 stone steps up a rocky caress constructed by pious monks in the early centuries A.D. I started up the trail from the rear of the monastery, past several trees struggling to find enough moisture in the crevices to hold on to life. The trail passed old stone ruins of the early pilgrims to Sinai, and as the trail got steeper and rockier, I changed my mind about walking, decided to wait until the morning and take the camel trail. Meet Moses, the son of one of the camel drivers. He is telling me that his father has a very good camel that could take me to the mountain of Moses, much better than walking, and his camel's name was Elijah, a very good name, he said. So I followed him over to the camel corral, and Moses pointed out his father's camel, but too late. One of the monks was on Elijah and about to start up the trail. I watched for a while, thought it looked easy, and would certainly save a stiff climb. There were other camels waiting for customers, so I had to start the old Arab custom of bargaining. How much will you pay? How much do you want? Too much? How about $5? Okay. Soon I was mounted and ready to take off. Whoops, didn't plan to take off that way. I had learnt my first lesson about a camel. Only half a camel gets up or down at a time. Moses was right. This did beat walking. And without having to watch where I was going, I could really sightsee. The trail wound around the mountain, steadily going higher and higher. In the distance, we could see the traditional chapel of Aaron, who is known to have visited the biblical Sinai. The trail continually winds upward, passing an inscribed stone slab, which reads, "Blessed as they whom God encounters here, to make a covenant of love with them, to unite himself with them, to take them into his heart and being, on this path, the path of his commandments." I had a fast camel and soon caught up with a monk on Moses' father's camel, wobbling from side to side. I decided to follow him, so when he rested, I rested. And when he rode on, I rode on behind him. We passed another pilgrim on the trail, resting, and seeing him rested, the monk decided to rest too. When the monk dismounted, I tried to talk to him, but he didn't speak English, and what he answered was all Greek to me. From this height, the ruggedness of the surrounding mountain becomes more pronounced. Finally, we reached the end of the camel trail. I thanked Elijah for getting me safely here, but he seemed very unimpressed by his rider, who could not speak Arabic. Then it was up the last 1,000 feet on foot, helped by some rough steps hewn out of the rock, and in some places loosely set as steps. This trail is only some 100 years old. Before that, all visitors had to climb the 7,800 steps from the monastery, a climb that takes several hours. Finally, the very top of Jebel Musa was in sight, a very welcome sight, I might add. We are nearly 8,000 feet above sea level here. The chapel that crowns the summit supposedly covers the very site where Moses received the tablets of the law from the hand of God. The chapel is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was built in 1934 with material from an earlier church erected in 532 AD by Justinian. It had been repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt over the centuries. The chapel contains icons and pictures dating back hundreds of years and is kept locked to the general public except for holy days. The bell hanging in the arch is rung at the monthly service held here by the monks of St. Catherine. A few yards away is a mosque in a very dilapidated condition. The Muslims also revere Moses as a prophet, as they do many of the Old Testament patriarchs. They also believe that the prophet Muhammad rested here with his camel, as they were both flying to Aqaba. From the summit there is a view of the walking trail from the monastery. It comes up the ravine in the upper corner of this picture. Under the mosque is a crevice claimed by the monks to be where Moses was sheltered during his long discourse with God. Exodus chapter 33 states in verse 22 that God put Moses in a cleft in the rock. My cameraman voiced skepticism and decided to check it out for himself. His comments: Moses would have needed chiropractic treatment if he had spent much time in there. However, the Arabs have dug out a more livable area in the recess. Roberts gives us this interesting painting of the two chapels on the summit of Jebel Musa. Other artists have executed their art on the exposed rocks on the summit. These inscribed crosses by the thousands represent centuries of pilgrims doing homage to their belief that here God gave Moses the tablets of the law. We know the biblical account is true, but it is hard to visualize this mountaintop as the true site. Perhaps nowhere in the world is the face of nature more ruggedly sublime than here. This southern portion of the Sinai Peninsula is a mass of granitic mountains, broken up into most irregular and fantastic forms. The dryness of the air and the natural hardness of the rock have not allowed time to exert corrosive influences. After viewing this Mount Sinai, it is difficult to believe that God told Moses to climb these steep rocky slopes to receive the law. And listen to this: to build a fence around this mountain, as recorded in Exodus chapter 19, verse 2. After seeing this rocky terrain, can you picture Moses actually building a fence around Mount Sinai, a distance of over 40 miles? To descend the mountain, I decided to take the long trail of stone steps in order to visit several traditional sites, one being the cave where the prophet Elijah is supposed to have lived. The pilgrimage of Elijah to Sinai, or Horeb as it is sometimes called, is the only instance recorded in the Bible of any of the Israelites visiting the scene where the law was given. The stone step path is much steeper than the camel trail, and the irregular heights of each step make it easy to stumble, and many visitors do so. Again, I found myself following the same monk I had followed that morning. He had been meditating all day in the summit chapel. Several hundred feet lower down, the trail flattens out into a small basin surrounded on three sides by towering heights. In the midst of the basin is a small rock chapel of Elijah, covering the cave entrance. It was closed up, but I have this painting by Roberts of the interior. The path continues to wind downward and soon passes under a narrow stone arch between two perpendicular rocks. In ancient times, a priest would sit there, and all who went up to the mountain had to make their confessions to him. And only after receiving absolution could they continue on to worship in the chapel of the Ten Commandments. I tried to picture Moses climbing up through this fractured rocky crevice, knowing that in his day there were no stone steps to facilitate his climbing. I tried to climb down this ravine without the use of stone steps, and found it impossible to do so without sliding down on my seat, using my hands to cushion the bumps. Even using the steps is difficult due to the looseness and different heights of the stones, ranging from 6 to 14 inches in height. Lower down, the path passes under another stone arch, a place also used in ancient times by a priest to check on the sincerity of the pilgrims, weeding out the curious from the devout. Looking back at the arch, the unevenness of the stone steps is obvious. And lower down, and looking up, their unevenness is even more pronounced. Now compare this view with the same view painted by Roberts over 100 years ago. A few more steps down the trail brings the visitor to the little chapel of the Virgin that some scholars believe was the original monastery of the 2nd century, before Justinian built the fortress, and where the burning bush was first identified. Continuing on down brings the monastery of St. Catherine into view, and soon the visitor can add his or her name to the countless thousands of pilgrims who have climbed this Mount Sinai. From the monastery, one looks out toward the plain that is pointed out as the area where the children of Israel encamped, a plain exaggerated in size by Roberts' painting to lend credence to the multitude as reported by the Bible narrative to have sojourned here. After viewing the traditional site of Mount Sinai, can one now believe the claim that Jethro with his family lived in this wash, and that his vast herds grazed on this ground that is and has been devoid of vegetation for at least 1,000,000 years, and wherever winter flash floods raged through this little valley? Only the walls built by the monks protecting the meager supply of soil which supports the garden and fruit trees of the monastery. As interesting as St. Catherine's Monastery is, with all its priceless mosaics and treasures, logic rules out that it covers the site of Jethro's home. Jebel Musa is not the biblical Sinai, but like an icon, it has and will continue to bring to the visitor's mind remembrance of God's dealing with his people Israel. The early Christians came to Mount Sinai because they thought it was sacred ground. And even though it is not the biblical Sinai, I believe it has become sacred ground by over 1,400 years of daily prayers of praise to our God. We may never know where the light from the divine fire shone forth in the burning bush was located, but at the biblical Sinai, God established the nation of Israel, a people destined to be recipient of the promises that God made to our father Abraham centuries before. The film you have just seen, Sinai, A Closer Look, raises some questions left unanswered. However, it should be obvious that the early monks living in Sinai planted the now traditional sites which have been accepted for centuries because very few people have ever visited Sinai to see for themselves the utter impossibility of this being the biblical Sinai. Yes, there is indeed a biblical Sinai, where God spoke to Moses and where he established and formed his people Israel into a nation that fell from grace, but was redeemed by Christ at Calvary. Then where is the true biblical Mount Sinai, you may be wondering? Well, while the actual location still remains unknown, there are several possible sites. One site is Har Karkom, a hill near the Negev-Sinai border. There are striking parallels between the biblical description of Mount Sinai and recent discoveries made at Har Karkom. In the book of Exodus, chapter 24 and verse 4, we read, "And Moses rose up early in the morning and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel." At the foot of the hill have been found 12 stone pillars near a stone structure that could be the remains of an altar. Exodus chapter 33 and verses 21 and 22 reads, "And the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passeth by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hands while I pass by." It is very unusual to find a cleft or niche on the very summit of any mountain, but there is just such a cleft or small cave at the top of Har Karkom. Around the mountain are several stone menhirs, that is, upright standing stones, stone circles, and stone platforms with altars, all clear indications of past religious activities. And an enormous number of religious rock paintings have been discovered here. This intriguing inscription depicts a twisting snake next to a rod or staff, which may indicate a snake turning into a staff. Could this be graffiti relating to the Exodus when Moses displayed God's power by turning his staff into a snake and back again? Divided into 10 spaces, this grid art could represent a rectangular stone tablet. Although no writings or symbols are engraved on this rock, could this be a representation of the tablets on which were written the 10 Commandments? In this scene, a stick-like figure of a man appears to be at prayer before a simple abstract line, a figure found repeatedly on many rocks in this area. In fact, here in the Negev is to be found the richest concentration of rock art found anywhere. One archaeologist has suggested that this circle with the rays extending out in all directions, seen on the right here, might represent the eye of God. Also of a later period is this rock drawing having 8 lines engraved below what appears to be a maze. What it is intended to portray is unknown, but it may represent some 8 important tenets of the religion of the people who occupied this area for a period of time. This drawing depicts a pastoral scene showing the docile goats, including a male goat with long curving horns, moving slowly toward a man on the left, reminding us of Moses tending Jethro's flocks. In this scene, a hunter releases an arrow to fell an ibex. Trapped by the hunter's pack of dogs is another ibex, which no doubt will join its mate as food for the hunter's family. The physical similarities and suggestive rock art relating to Mount Sinai is intriguing. There is, however, one major problem identifying Har Karkom as the biblical Mount Sinai, and that is, archaeological findings had determined that Har Karkom to have been an important religious site, but datings of the occupation period reveal that the site was occupied from the 3rd millennium BC and through the early Bronze Age, periods in which most of the rock drawings were made. And as down as far as the Middle Bronze Age, when the site was virtually abandoned. Now, this is a period in which the Exodus occurred, a period much too late in time. In order to fit the time frame of the Exodus, the accepted date being around 1453 BC, the Exodus would have to be found to be in error. But that date has been chronologically established, being in the late Bronze Age. This would eliminate Har Karkom as being the true Mount Sinai. Another and more recent suggestion for Mount Sinai is Jebel el-Laz, a mountain northeast of the Gulf of Aqaba in Saudi Arabia. It is in an area of ancient volcanic activity which fits the Bible record. Advocates of this site have suggested that the darker hued stones near the top of the mountain were colored by the fiery display of thermal heat and energy that accompanied the descent of God to the top of this mountain, as recorded in Exodus chapter 19. This is an unsupportable conclusion. Being part of an ancient volcanic area would account for the fire-blackened rock. Researchers also point out the remains of stone pillars and circles with an abundance of petroglyphs that feature Egyptian images of Hathor and sacred cows. However, it is too great a stretch of the imagination to relate these images with the golden calf the Israel people erected, which was an idol which only lasted a very short time, those engaged in its worship being slain. It is also highly unlikely that witnesses to that event would engage in reproduction of paintings and drawings of hundreds of calves, images of calves, especially as that image caused the death of some 3,000 of their number. Furthermore, Jebel el-Laz is over 8,000 feet in height, which is not compatible with the description of Mount Sinai in the Bible. In any case, the mountain and other sites nearby are now closed off with fences and guards of the Saudi Arabian government in order to preserve the archaeological integrity. Thus, any further investigation is restricted. Another and perhaps more acceptable location for Mount Sinai may be one of the peaks in a range of low hills in a series of mountains, generally known as Mount Seir, that forms the western and southern frontiers of what used to be Edom. These hills are just a few miles west of the ancient Edomite nation, whose capital city was Petra. The Edomites became the richest of the Transjordanian tribes. God's judgment on Esau, Edom, is found in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 35 and 36. Although the nation of Edom was destroyed, Edomite people continued and infiltrated the tribe of Judah and became proselytes to Judaism and called themselves Jews. They make up a large percentage of the Israeli nation of today. There is much biblical activity recorded as taking place in this area. We find such names as Wadi Musa, meaning the Valley of Moses, and Mount Hor, the traditional site where Aaron died and was buried. Several biblical references clearly place Mount Sinai in the mountains of Seir. One example is in the book of Judges, chapter 5 and verse 4, where the prophetess Deborah poetically associates Sinai with Seir. When thou wentest out of Seir, when thou marchest out of the fields of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped water. The mountains melted from before the Lord, even that Sinai, from before the Lord God of Israel. Even St. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, chapter 4, verse 25, locates Sinai in Arabia, which excludes the Sinai Peninsula. He writes, "For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. This locates it, or Mount Horeb, within the borders of Midian, this area being known as the wilderness of Sinai." Another clue as to the location of the real Mount Sinai is found in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 1, which reads, "Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb." The traditional site of Sinai is in the heart of the mountainous region of the Sinai Peninsula, more than 100 miles from the Gulf of Aqaba, the nearest Midianite country. Can you imagine Moses leading the Midianite flocks of livestock through these hundreds of miles of rugged mountains with little or no water, even less fodder to sustain the animals, and with the prospect of having them end up as a present to the warlike Amalekites in the Wadi Faran area. Although most Bible scholars are looking for Mount Sinai as a high mountain peak, it should be pointed out the Hebrew word har, or H-A-R, translate mountain, can also be translated 3 different ways: mountain, mount, or hill. Exodus chapter 3, verse 12 reads, "Ye shall serve God upon this mountain." Exodus chapter 19, verse 2 reads, "And there Israel camped before the mount." Exodus chapter 24 and verse 4 reads, "Moses builded an altar under the hill." So the word mountain can also mean a low hill, such as the Mount of Olives or Mount Jezreel, both called Har in the Hebrew. The Bible does not imply that Mount Sinai was a great height. On the contrary, the mountain needed to be fenced around to limit the approach of the people. And the idea of the 70 elders trying to scale the very steep and rocky gradient is not reasonable. The biblical approach to Mount Sinai is clearly indicated as rising gently from the plain to a prominent hill at no great distance from the encampment. I would rather suggest that the grandeur of Mount Sinai was due to the presence of God rather than its height. In patriarchal times, the ruling prince was also the chief priest. The term the flocks of Jethro would signify the entire wealth of the Midianites, which would be their cattle, camels, and sheep. It is logical that the wilderness of Sinai was actually a wide area of animal grazing country with ample water, where thousands of tribesmen were encamped under the order of Moses for the care and protection of their property. Now, this security could only be maintained as long as they were within the limits of their tribal territory and were well armed against any cattle raiding incursions from their neighbors, the Amalekites. The monks even transplanted Jethro from his home in the land of Midian over 150 miles to the northeast, with all his good grazing lands and ample water supply, to settle him in the dry desert wash next to St. Catherine's Monastery in the barren mass of granitic mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. I also did not mention the golden calf that Moses saw as he came down from the mountain. The sight shown today cannot be seen from Mount Sinai until one completely descends and walks out toward the plain, the only plain adjacent to the mountain, and too small to contain the number of people believed to have been in the Exodus. Also, the summit of the traditional Mount Sinai cannot be seen from this plain, as intervening ridge obscures it, whereas the Bible clearly states that the people down on the plain could view the mountain. And as I said before, could you conceive God commanding Moses to put a fence around the mountain I have shown you? It should now be obvious to anyone that the biblical and physical evidence eliminates the traditional Mount Sinai as the Mount of God, where Moses received the laws of God. The traditional Mount Sinai is simply a forgery, dating possibly from the 2nd century AD.